So over the last several months together, we have been looking through the book of Genesis, right? We've been trying to say, hey, what are the questions that Genesis was designed and written to answer, to help us answer about the human experience and about who God is, the God that we come to know on the pages of Scripture. Answering questions like, why are we here, right? Not so much the what or the how. Those are interesting questions, I think, but I think Genesis is saying primarily at the why. Like, why are we here? What is God up to in the world? And then I think more specifically the question, why can we trust the God of the Scriptures, the God of the story of Genesis, over and above the other lowercase g gods, right? Not the powers and principalities and stories and things that we are presented with as human beings as ways to make sense of our lives. Why can we trust Yahweh over and above those stories, over and above other worldviews and things that humanity has used across time to sort of make sense out of life? And in light of that question, how then are we supposed to live as people who have come to trust this story as a story that gives meaning and purpose to our lives? So we looked at stories over the last 4 months or so, like Adam and Eve, right? We looked at stories of the creation accounts of Cain and Abel, the building of the Tower of Babel, the flood, Noah's family after the flood, and then we spent the last 6 weeks or so looking at a man named Abram, a woman named Sarai, their son Isaac, and the story through which God would bless all the families of the earth. So that makes sense. I just want to sort of recap. That's what we've been talking about the last 4 months. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of territory together. So I know a lot of that may be jumbled up in your minds. So today I just wanted to kind of slow down and just kind of pull that apart and see maybe where God has been working in our hearts as we've walked through that. I was going to be honest, I've enjoyed this last season. Teaching through it, reading through it, studying through it with you has been it's been a huge blessing. We adopted a cat out of the whole thing because of creation care. So I don't know, this cat, stray cat walks up our back door and it's like meowing at me. And I'm like, well, the Lord created and gave me a job in creation, so I guess I can't let this thing starve to death. So now we have a cat out of this. So if we didn't get anything else out of it, we got a cat. But all seriousness, I've been challenged a lot over this last season, just thinking about what do we believe and why are we going after it? What are we trusting in as a church, and specifically as a man, as a father, and as a family? I've been reminded of some things that I knew at one point, but maybe had forgotten along the way. Some things that I think are really important for how I know and relate to God. And then if I'm honest, that are really important then because of that for how I know and relate to myself. And if I'm honest, I've learned some things that I didn't know before this journey through Genesis that we've been on together. Like I've learned some new things about God and about myself. And I pray that's been your experience as well over the last 4 months. But this morning, like I said, I wanted to take advantage of the slowness of the season. Like sometimes we look around, we're like, oh man, it's Thanksgiving. Like I want to take advantage of the slowness of the season, of the ability to sit down around a table and look at people that we love and know and trust and talk about things that really matter. I want to sit around these tables this morning and give all that we've learned and all that we've remembered and all that we've been convinced by and convicted by over the last 4 months or so as we've walked through the text of Genesis together, one more chance to work its way just a little bit deeper into our hearts. Does that make sense? And so I wanted to give us one more chance before we kind of stop and pivot and go into the season of Advent and then the season of kind of mission beyond the season of Advent, which we'll talk about in announcements this morning and through the next couple of weeks together. But I wanted to give this information that we've been learning a chance to lead to greater formation in our hearts. Right? We live in a time, I heard a pastor from India one time say that if information could change the world, like America should be the center of change. And I go, discipleship doesn't just happen because we learn some things, right? Discipleship and commitment to the way of Jesus happens because we allow the information that we've learned to form us together in community. And so I just want to give a chance this morning for that to happen, one more chance. So just really quickly, I want to journey back through quickly the first 22 chapters of Genesis. And some of you are like, this is going to take forever. It's not. We're going to look at 3 texts, I promise. You're like, Matt, with 22 chapters, you're going to be here until Jesus comes back. Not just celebrate his birth, but so I want to look back and just and kind of remind us and just pull some things out and read some text and then talk about it. Sound good? All right, the first thing I want to talk about is rest and trust. So Genesis chapter 2. You remember all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, right? God has created the heavens and the earth. He's ordered all things, and then he's filled all things through the 6 days of creation. The first 3, right, are ordering. The second 3 are filling. We talked about all this so long ago. We had a chart on the screen. There were arrows and diagrams and all that sort of stuff. But on the 7th day, on the 6th day, God creates humanity, Adam and Eve, male and female in his image, and he looks out and he says, this is very good. And then on the 7th day, God blesses it and makes it holy and rests, right? So look at the scripture here. I think Abby's going to put it on the screen for us. This is Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And so we got this picture, right, of God doing all of this, looking out over his creation and saying, it's done, it's finished, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, over and over. And then he looks at humanity in this kind of crowning moment of creation. He says, it is very good, I'm done, right? We talked about like a skilled sculptor knows when to lay the hammer down, when one more blow on the statue with a hammer and chisel would ruin it. And it's like he knows, like, it's good, it's done, it's complete, nothing, it lacks nothing, there's nothing else for me to do. And after that, God rests, he Sabbaths. And the first thing, this is really important, I think, for us, the first thing that Adam and Eve know, and the first thing they experience, created on day 6, waking up into day 7, is the rest of God. The first thing they experience is not the work that God has for them to do, though he does give them meaningful work to do, naming the animals, co-ruling over his creation. He gives them meaningful, significant work to do. But the first thing they experience, the first thing humanity experiences, is the rest of God in a good and beautiful creation. And I think that's really, really important, that their work flows from their rest. Their work does not earn them rest. Let me say that again. That their work in the world, what they do, what they put their hands to, what they give their lives to, it flows from a place of rest. It doesn't earn them rest, right? Just think about how our minds are wired, how our weeks are wired, right? How we sing songs about, like, well, we don't anymore because this is a really old song, but like working for the weekend, right? That's a lyric somewhere from like the 60s, right? Like, we work for the weekend. We work for the rest. When we get everything done, then we can rest. I've got to do some things before I can rest, right? The first thing that Adam and Eve know in the story of a good and beautiful creation, a good and graceful God, is rest. And he rests and he delights in them and he invites them into rest. So here's some questions. Again, these are like, I'm not the greatest question asker, and so if you don't like these questions, that's fine. That's okay. Ask your own at the table, right? In light of that, that's the first story we get, God creating and Adam and Eve experiencing the rest of God. Here's some questions that I would love for you to kick around your tables, right? And let's just name it awkward silence. It's okay. It happens, all right? Sit through it. You don't have to fill it, but if you do have something to contribute, jump in, throw it out, okay? So here's some questions I'd just love for you to think about over the next 5 minutes or so. How is God's invitation to rest an invitation to trust? Is it? How would ordering our lives around healthy rhythms of rest and work be helpful? How would it be hard? Or what does our inability or ability to rest say about the places and things we have trusted in terms of our identity? Those are big questions. They're heavy questions. So maybe you want to write them down, think about them during the week. But I would love to give you that time to think about the dynamic of rest and work when it comes to identity. And if you don't like the question, that's okay. But I think it's worth asking. So Matt's going to turn on a little music for us, I think, and we'll talk. So feel free to chat. You're dismissed into that, and I'll call you back and we'll do a couple more. Sound good? All right. If there's something you didn't get to say that you wanted to say, feel free to like hold it and come back to it. This is not like a linear sort of thing. We can go back and forth, and hopefully the stories like inform each other, and the conversation informs itself as well. So that last question is a really important one, right? I think that thinking about where our trust lies says a lot about our identity, right? As far as like where we put our trust in who we are and where we get our identity from, right? The next story in the biblical text is a story of trust, right? About Adam and Eve, about what God has said about them, about who they are. And then their inability to trust, right? When the serpent comes and says, but did God really say, right? Did he really say, like, look at what you're missing out on. Look, you can reach out and take it for yourself. And there's some trust in their own self right there. And I think that's something that, at least for me in my life, I haven't gotten past, right? The temptation to trust in my own ability to provide, to get what I want, to get what I need, to get what I think my family needs. And then the story after that is one I want to spend a little time. I think it's the story that maybe most impacted me, which is I didn't expect kind of looking at it. I thought maybe something in Abraham's story. But this is the thing that, like, when I close my eyes at night, sometimes to go to sleep, I'm like, oh, Cain and Abel, right? Which is not necessarily the place you want. Like, that's kind of a weird place to go. Like, but I think it's like powerful, right? Because of all the stories, the story of Cain and his brother has been the one that I think has stuck out to me the most. And I think it's because of the power of a name and identity in that whole story, right? If you remember the story of Cain and Abel, we talked about how Eve looks at her son and she names him literally acquired, and her Like that's what his name means in Hebrew. And there's this sense that that through Yahweh's provision and faithfulness, even after the fall, that she has a son now. And she's named him Acquired. Like, I have acquired him because of the faithfulness of the Lord, right? And he's named that, and he carries his name through the rest of his life, trying to live into that identity. I don't know if you guys think often about names and about the significance of names. My middle name is Jason. It's my uncle's name. And so my whole life as a kid, that was kind of a thing in our family. It was like, hey, like, you're named after this person in your family who loves you, and like, here's sort of a person to live up to and to look up to. You have his name, right? And so I spent Thanksgiving with my uncle Jason. There's always something that's like there. We've had an amazing relationship. But my whole life I've been kind of aware of that, right? That a name means something. And so I think Cain, you see, spends the rest of his life trying to live into that identity of acquired, of the provision of God. And so it kind of comes this moment, right, that as she looks into the face of her eldest son, she says, like, man, it is Yahweh's faithfulness. Even on the other side of the fall, he hasn't gone anywhere. He's with us, that has gifted our family this son, right, that has continued humanity in the person of Cain, her son. And as he grows older, we see him battling with his name, right? He becomes a man who's defined by acquiring, right? He becomes a farmer, and he and his brother come to this moment. They offer sacrifices to Yahweh, and Yahweh isn't pleased with Cain's for some reason that we're not told. But Cain gets sort of mixed up in this, right? And instead of saying, okay, what was lacking in my sacrifice or the motives behind it or what I brought, he says, like, oh, my brother's sacrifice is now a threat to me acquiring that which I think I need for life, right? It's kind of the story that we get. And it's never about Abel's sacrifice. But Cain comes to see his brother as a threat to his ability to acquire by his own effort, by his own wisdom, by his own strength, by his own work, that which he wants and needs from life, in an effort to protect that, to earn Yahweh's favor, to keep Yahweh's favor over and above his brother, that moves him to murder his brother Abel. And the first story of murder we get in the human story is like a couple chapters into the biblical story, right? It's committed, but right before that, this is the text I want us to look at. This is what Yahweh says to Cain, right before he takes his brother's life. Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 6. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? We talk about this as Yahweh coming to Cain saying, hey, this has nothing to do with your brother's sacrifice. This is between me and you. Like, why are you upset? Why are you angry? Why are you mad? And then he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And there's a lot we could talk about there, right? But I think the point of all of this is that Cain has been trying to earn, secure, and live into an identity that was already his by right. I think you see that sort of in Yahweh's response to Cain. Like, why are you angry? Like, what are you, like... What are you doing? Why have you questioned this? Why is this up for debate in your mind, right? It says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. And I love that sort of like, and I think it's worth talking about this morning. How does our identity and our desire to try to earn our identity open the door for sin patterns or brokenness in our lives, right? When we get that sort of identity sort of disordered, how does that open the door for this sort of thing, right? That Cain looks at his brother and says, you're a threat to me, and I got to get rid of the threat. His mom named him Acquired because of God's provision. He's understood his name to be acquired by his own efforts. And it leads him to a difficult spot. So here's some questions. Again, if you don't like them, feel free to talk about your own. But here's some things we can think about. So Cain has been trying to earn, to secure, to live into an identity that was already his by right. Have you ever found yourself there? You ever been there? What did it look like for you in that space? What does it look like for you when you have warring sort of visions and understandings of our identities? Or how does misunderstanding our identity relate to sin patterns in our lives? What does it mean for sin to be crouching at the door? And I love that. I love the way that Yahweh says that, right? Because I think, like Cain has sinned. It's like, not yet. Like, not yet. He's angry, he's upset, he's misunderstood. But Yahweh says, hey, you're about to do something. That you're in a position to be overtaken by sin that wants to rule over you in your life because of the way you've understood what's happening in your life and your situation. What does it mean for sin to be crouching at the door? And then most of us desire to rule over sin. How can we? Could it be as simple as remembering who we are? Could those two things be related? I don't know, I think that's worth chatting about this morning. So take some time, talk about those things or anything else from this story that stands out, or go back to Genesis chapter 2 if you want as well. So the time is yours. Take a couple minutes and we'll talk about that, and then we'll finish up with one more conversation point. All right. Hold that right there. Maybe there's some stuff there worth writing about in your journal, praying about, thinking about. I think there's an interesting connection there between identity and, at least for me, when I started examining the things I believed about myself and about other people, it begins to illuminate kind of the places that I'm like, oh, that's maybe where I'm missing it, right? Maybe I'm not living into the fullness of God's invitation for me. I heard Lindsay Cage just say the idea of like ruling over sin, I think is worth like thinking about and praying about, right? Because at least for me growing up, I was like, oh, sin desires to have you, and I've got to keep from being. It's like no, like the freedom of Jesus invites us to rule. Like that, it's not, we don't have to be threatened by that sort of thing, but there is a reality in which if we're misunderstanding like what's happening, the desire of sin, the desire of brokenness, the desire of the evil one is to have us. And we're invited through, I think, remembering who we are and who Yahweh is to rule over that sort of thing. So I don't know, maybe there's worth continued conversation there. The last thing I'll talk about, Genesis 15, kind of moving into the idea of like trusting Yahweh because of his provision for us and his presence with us. So in Genesis 15, we kind of fast forward pretty far in the story. Abraham, remember, he's been chosen by God as the conduit of his grace and mercy to the nations. And the promise that God's been making to Abram over and over in his story, right? I will make you into a great nation. I will bless all the nations, all the families of earth through you, right? Abraham and his wife couldn't have children. God kept promising. Abraham keeps trusting. He keeps moving. He messes up. He continues along the path. And there comes a moment in Abraham's story when he looks up at Yahweh and he says, but God, how can I know? Right? Have you ever been there? Like, I know the promise. I've heard the promise. You've been reassuring me along the way. But he says, God, how can I know? There's no promised son yet. How can I know, Lord, that what you're saying is true? Verse 9 of Genesis chapter 15. So the Lord said to him after that question, Lord, how can I know? He says, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away, right? So Abram comes to God. He says, hey, how can I know? And God's response in that moment is like, okay, go get some stuff, right? We talked about this several weeks ago. Go get some stuff. He tells him what to get, not what to do with what he's gotten, right? I think Abraham knew what to do with the things that God had sent him after, right? Because this is a covenant. This is a betrothal covenant in the ancient Near East, right? Abram gets everything prepared. This is the consecration, the consummation of a relationship and a promise. Abraham gets everything prepared. And the way the covenant would have worked is that both parties of the covenant, they were entering into the contract, the promise, they would have walked through the blood of these animals that had collected in a trench, basically saying, if I don't uphold my end of the deal, then may what happened to these animals happen to me. You can do this to me if I don't fulfill my end of the promise. And I think we get this picture of Abraham sitting there looking at a covenant prepared, but not yet consummated, because he knows he walks first and he can't do it. I love that detail about like the birds of like prey coming down on the carcasses of the animals. Like they've been sitting there long enough to get the vulture's attention, right? And he's just sitting here staring at this like covenant that has been like laid out, but he can't walk through the path because I think he knows like, oh, I can't do this, right? Like I'm about to enter into a covenant, a contract with the God of the universe, and I'm not going to hold my end of the deal up, right? And this is an amazing moment where he's just sitting there looking at this covenant that's been prepared but not yet consummated, right? And then verse 17, in the middle of all of that, when the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. This is significant for a lot of reasons. This represents God's presence, right, in the Old Testament. Throughout the scriptures, we see God's presence come in smoke and fire, right? It fills the tabernacle. The people of Israel follow fire through the night, right? This is Yahweh showing up. And the interesting thing is that Yahweh's presence here is represented by two things. There's two kind of presences, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch. And both of them walk the path, right? This is God, I think, saying, I will walk the path for myself and I'll walk it for you, Abraham. I know you can't keep your end of the bargain. I know you can't keep your end of the deal. I'll walk it for you. It's a moment of great grace. This is the gospel, like before we ever get to Jesus in the scriptures. This is the beauty of the gospel, right? God walking the path for us, making a promise to us, and then upholding our end of the promise that we can never keep. It's Yahweh saying, I think I'll provide for you when you can't keep your end of the deal. When it's too costly for you, I'll pay it. This is how committed I am to you, to this, to redemption, to the promise I made you, Abram, and by extension to the promise I made to all peoples. I will walk it for you. And that's an image that's stuck with me over the last several weeks. I don't know about you. We see this obviously kind of culminate in the person of Jesus. We'll celebrate his sacrifice here in a minute as we take communion together. But before we get to that point of the morning, I want to just leave a couple more questions with you. Maybe this gets a little bit more anecdotal. Maybe it's a little more sharing. I don't know where you're at this morning, but these are the questions I want us to think about. Have you ever had an experience like this? I mean, if you've ever experienced the Lord like make a covenant with you, do share that. You can have the microphone. Come tell that story. But have you ever had an experience like this? If so, I just encourage you to share it. Like maybe it's one of radical provision and grace. You weren't expecting it. You came up at the end of something. You're like, I'm at the end of myself. I don't know what to do. And the Lord provides in a radical and beautiful way. If so, share it. Or maybe this morning you feel like you're sitting in front of something that you don't know how you'll ever walk the path ahead of you. And that's okay too. Both are worth sharing. And in a place like this, I think both of those stories help to move us deeper into discipleship and relationships. So have you ever experienced the radical provision of God in a moment like this? Are you sitting before something this morning where you're like, I don't know how I'm going to walk that. I really don't know. I'm at the end of myself. I'm undone. And wherever you are this morning, I would just encourage you to share that with one another. I think both of those things are worth sharing and should be honored in the sharing of them. And then maybe this question, how are provision and trust related? Where have you experienced God in this way? Or where are you needing to? Like where do you just need the provision of God? And where in the past have you experienced it and it's grown trust in you if you have? So feel free to talk about those things for just a couple minutes and then we'll take communion together. But take 2 or 3 more minutes, talk about those questions or any others that have come up this morning, and then we'll finish with a time of communion. Sound good? Okay, hang on just right there. I want to set this up. We're going to take communion together now. And so I want us to lean into the realization, if we can, that this meal isn't just something that we do ritualistically every Sunday. This is something that we take and that we experience and that we celebrate together as a way to embrace and build trust in what God is doing, right? This is a meal that we take and we say, oh, this is one. If you're thinking about these stories, this is one of them that we experience every week, right? That we've all experienced this sort of spirit, the trustworthiness and the faithfulness of God and the celebration of the life and the death and the life again of his son, Jesus. And so I don't want to talk more about that. I want you guys to continue the conversation that you were having if you feel like you want to, but over a communion meal. So I'm going to invite you to get up, grab bread and juice, come back to your table. Somebody bless it. But more than that, let's just name what we're thankful for, right? Lord, I'm thankful for the way that you provided in that situation. I'm thankful for the way that you've walked with me, that you paid a price I can never pay, like Jesus in your life and death and life again. Or let's pray for each other and know, I don't know how I'm going to walk through this. I don't know what's coming next, but as I hold the body of the broken body of the Lord Jesus and the spilled blood of the Lord Jesus, I'm reminded that no matter what comes, he's with me in it and will be faithful to the end. Mainly his glory and our joy in the redemption and restoration of all things, right? So I just encourage you, go do that. Pray together. Thank the Lord. Just name what you're thankful for. Name the places that you need to experience the provision. Let's just sit with that together for a couple more minutes this morning, and then we'll finish in a time of worship. Sound good?